Coming up on Judge Rinder's Crime Stories. A gang plan an audacious drug smuggling operation.
We were now convinced that this was going to be a run, and this was probably going to be a landing site.
And later, an 18-year-old is brutally attacked.
There was all footprints over his body, over his face.
But what caused this horrific act of violence to take place?
How anyone could do that to another human being is beyond understanding.
Organised crime is one of the biggest threats to our national security, blighting communities, ruining lives, and costing the UK well over £20 billion each year. The National Crime Agency and Border Force work tirelessly protecting our borders from these criminals who attempt to import drugs, firearms, and cash to fuel their activities. This is a story behind Operation Simian.
My name's Dan Scully, and it's my responsibility to make sure we gather and develop the right intelligence to help Border Force protect the UK border. £618 billion worth of goods moving across the border. We have to work across all of that volume to identify the suspicious activity.
Drug smuggling into the UK by organised criminals remains a major part of the work of Border Force.
The vast majority of drugs have to be imported. Their source countries are in other parts of the world. Our challenge is to look for all the places people would seek to hide drugs, all the different types of transport they would use.
One area that's been targeted by criminals is the use of small aircraft and local airfields to smuggle drugs and people from abroad into the country.
There's a huge number of sites, around 3,000 sites, dealing with general aviation, and these tend to be small, remote locations. So historically, it was a really expensive way to travel into the UK, to charter a small aircraft. That's become a bit cheaper, so people can pick up these light aircraft routes from the near continent, from a little bit further afield, and they perceive it as a safer way to bring illicit goods or people into the UK.
In early 2016, a UK Border Force officer was monitoring flight data when he spotted something unusual. For security reasons, we are protecting his identity.
In February 2016, I identified a German aircraft which appeared to come from the continent, flying over Kent. It was unusual in that we couldn't actually identify the details of persons on board or exactly where it had come from. We started ringing local airfields to see if they were expecting it, but nobody was. As we were monitoring it, it literally did a U-turn and went back to the continent. That in itself is unusual, but not necessarily suspicious. There could be a number of reasons why it did it. It could be a sightseeing trip. It's just one of those things.
When the officer looked into the plane's flight history, he noticed that this wasn't the first time it had flown over this particular airspace.
And noticed that there had been 2 previous flights in 2015, and when we looked at the tracks of these, they followed exactly the same pattern, basically coming up over Kent, doing a U-turn and going back again. From the satellite imagery that we looked at, all we could really see was open fields and a few farmhouses, really, so it was very sparsely populated and pretty open farmland.
Checks with Belgian authorities identified the pilot to be Belgian national, Rudy Sales.
He was known to the Belgian authorities for some criminal activity, and that he was an ex-military pilot with the Belgian Air Force.
Border Force continued to monitor Sales, and a month later he was flying the same aircraft on the same unusual flight path.
This made it slightly more suspicious in that we've now got a pattern of events together with the results of the checks from the Belgian authorities. So we took it to the National Crime Agency, discussed it with them, and they took it on as an investigation.
My name's Gary Fennelly. I lead the investigation teams for the NCA. I mean, what we had is we had a plane and a pilot that we were suspicious of, but no idea what, if anything, he was up to.
The first break in this case came when the NCA were alerted that Sales was coming to the UK via ferry into Dover on the 15th of June 2016.
We were looking to see what he was up to, and that's when our operational team took control.
Gary instructed his undercover surveillance team to get eyes on the suspect.
It was imperative that we saw exactly what he was doing here and who he met and what he was planning.
At that stage, we had no criminal associates here in the UK that we were aware of that he was working with, which is why the work done by the team from Dover onwards was absolutely critical.
Rudy Sells came into the UK on a ferry driving a dark-coloured Mercedes. We followed him away from Dover to Rochester in Kent.
Sells was trailed to a rural pub.
At that pub, he met two individuals. We were able to gather intelligence and evidence of what was a plan being hatched by the three of them for something that was going to happen in the very near future. We were able to secretly film the whole of the meeting.
Documents were being shared by the three, including a picture of the light aircraft on. This now was looking very much like a conspiracy of some sort was taking place.
There was a lot of gesticulation and arms pointing up towards the sky, which quite clearly was some sort of indication of some activity with an aircraft. The two males shook hands with Sells and left the pub. Sells packed up his papers, put his jacket back on over his bright red jumper and also departed.
The two suspects who'd met Sells were observed to get into a grey Saab, a car registered to 41-year-old Michael Mealing. The NCA tracked the movements of the Saab.
Through surveillance, we then established that they had gone to a very quiet, rural location not too far from Faversham and had parked themselves on a small lane adjacent to a farmer's field. All three men were in the vehicle. Especially noticeable was Sells sitting in the rear of the vehicle because he was still wearing that bright red jumper.
Yeah, the challenge for us as the National Crime Agency was to take all these pieces of information and intelligence, observation, and build a picture as to what was going on. We were now convinced that this was going to be a run, and this was probably going to be a landing site.
Mealing and Sells were outside of the vehicle, pointing up at the sky and looking at paperwork and possibly a map.
Could the gang really be planning an audacious attempt to fly illegal cargo into a field? Sells left the country. Officers trailed Mealing to see if they could obtain more intelligence and identify the third member of the group.
Mealing drove to an address in the Watford area, close to the Warner Brothers studios. When he got out of the vehicle, he was carrying a large brown holdall that appeared to look quite heavy, and sometime later came out, still carrying the same bag, but it's quite clear that the bag wasn't as heavy as it was when he'd gone in there. After Mealing had left, we saw a black Range Rover depart the area, and driving the black Range Rover was a white male with grey hair and a grey beard, and I was confident that that was the same man that we had seen in the pub meeting with Mealing and Sells.
Using number plate recognition technology, they could now put a name to 41-year-old Andrew Barrett.
Andrew Barrett went to an address in Watford, which turned out to be very significant. Parked up his Range Rover and went into an address, which was the address for a Mr. Ryan. Sometime later, Michael Mealing arrived and from there drove a white van away from the address. Andrew Barrett drove the black Range Rover away from the address, and Ryan drove Michael Mealing's Saab away from the address. It was imperative that we kept them under surveillance to see what would happen next.
The team waited, hoping they would get a break. It came from Rudy Sells.
Working closely with our law enforcement colleagues in Belgium, we became aware that he'd put a flight plan in to fly from an airfield in Belgium to Le Touquet in northern France. There was no indication that he was going to land in the UK.
Could this be the flight and drop that the gang had been planning?
We had strong suspicions that In between those two places, he would fly over the southeast of England. We had no option but to deploy to the place that we'd seen them in the vehicle near Faversham, in that rural location, and just watch and see how things unfolded.
Limited access by road, which provided challenges for our operational team on the ground, but a perfect place to land an aircraft if you have the skill and unload whatever commodity you've got on board.
It was important that we maintained our covert locations. With a small team, we were able to put ourselves in a position where we could monitor the vehicle activity in the area, looking particularly for Barrett and Mealing's vehicles.
During the observations, a Land Rover was seen approaching with two gentlemen inside.
Michael Mealing was identified as one of the men. The other was unknown to them.
Mealing and the other man in the car were certainly there for only one reason, and that was to pick up what Sells was delivering.
The next thing that happened was a sighting of a small light aircraft flying into our area of operations.
Coming up, was this the plane being piloted by Sells? Would the NCA catch the gang red-handed?
The fact that the aircraft clearly had not landed caused us some confusion at the time. Had the job gone down? Had he decided to abort? Had he seen our team on the ground and changed his mind from landing?
Border Force officers had observed Belgian pilot Rudy Sells making several suspicious flights in his small aircraft over fields in Kent. They suspected he was planning to bring some form of illegal cargo into the country. Following an undercover operation by the NCA, 3 men had been identified as potential suspects working the UK side of the job. On the 23rd of June 2016, some of the gang were waiting in a field as a plane emerged. Would the NCA, watching from afar, catch them in the act?
One of my officers, who was in a key position, was able to spot the aircraft and photograph it. It was clear then that that aircraft was the aircraft that Sells was flying.
The aircraft was observed to descend and descend and then ascend again without landing. We were surprised that the aircraft didn't land. Previous experience would say that the aircraft would land, a very fast handover to vehicles, aircraft takes off again, job done. The fact that the aircraft clearly had not landed caused us some confusion at the time. Had the job gone down? Had he decided to abort? Had he seen our team on the ground and changed his mind from landing?
In order to make ourselves covert, that meant that we weren't able to see exactly what was happening in the field. Something must have been dropped out of the vehicle, because Mealing and the other man, they were seen with the rear door of the Land Rover open and seemed to be moving around in the field.
We assessed what has probably happened here is that Sells has flown his aircraft in low enough to be able to open a door on the aircraft and throw the cans out to be collected by the landing party.
It was quite clear that we were going to need to follow them away from that location and put in an interdiction as soon as we could.
They drove the vehicle to a timber yard in the Faversham area. At that point, decision was made to call in the arrests.
The reason they went into the timber yard is unknown, but once they put themselves in that position, they had no escape from there. So that was the ideal time to put in the strike, as we call it.
Michael Mealing and the other man, who identified himself as Jonathan Hart, were arrested.
I don't believe that Mealing and Hart knew they'd been under surveillance, so on arrest, they would have been very surprised that their day had come to a very sorry end. And of course, once we looked in the rear of the vehicle and saw those canisters, one of which had slightly split, and there was some white powder around the canister, it was quite clear that we had caught them red-handed.
We found 3 plastic jerry can type containers that had a lot of taping around them and looked like they'd been battered.
In the front of the vehicle was an ordnance survey map and some annotations on that, which were quite clearly where they had been directed to go in order to pick up the canisters once they'd been thrown out of the aircraft. That was really good evidence. There were a number of mobile phones in the vehicle as well, and we were satisfied then that we had arrested the right people and we were going to have sufficient evidence to prosecute them.
It turned out in the end that we had over 30 kilos of cocaine with street-level value of about 2.5 million. So at this moment in time, what we had was two guys with a lot of cocaine in a Land Rover. We didn't have the pilot because he had not landed, he hadn't been arrested, and we didn't have Barrett at the scene either. It was a good conclusion to the day, but not the end of the story.
The NCA's focus now shifted back to Barrett. They needed to prove that he was involved.
We needed to move pretty fast to try and locate Andrew Barrett, because we had enough evidence to prove that he was involved in this conspiracy as well. One of my team members quickly said, surely it's worth trying the address that we saw him at on the previous day.
Well, the team attended at Ryan's address and saw his black Range Rover parked up unattended near the property. So the decision was made to wait by the car, and hopefully he would return to it.
He didn't return on foot, but he came back to the address in a white van. He parked up the white van and went into Ryan's address carrying a box.
He then came out of the address, and at that point, he was arrested. Officers subsequently searched that white van and found quantities of cocaine, ecstasy, and cannabis, and a substantial amount of money.
Cocaine, cannabis and MDMA, with a street value of £1.5 million, was retrieved from the vehicle.
And then subsequently searched the house, found over £100,000 in cash, some drugs in the house. So Barrett had been arrested that day. Ryan was also arrested that day.
What was crucial here was the surveillance that was done on Barrett previously that took us to Ryan's address. Without that, we may not have arrested Barrett that day, but we certainly probably would have lost those drugs. One of the items that was recovered from the scene was an annotated piece of paper that seemed to match up to the paperwork that we'd retrieved from the Land Rover. This now, to me, proved a link between Barrett and Mealing and what had happened earlier that day with Sells.
It was a really good result, considering in the period of 8 days, we've managed to arrest 4 individuals for their involvement in a serious crime.
Having worked with quite fragmented pieces of intelligence, to pull together the operation within a period of just over a week was extremely satisfying. Key in any successful operation is collaboration. The National Crime Agency does not work in isolation. We work with various other colleagues, whether they are law enforcement from overseas to more closer to home, in this case, Border Force. Without that collaboration, this operation wouldn't have happened.
A trial date was fixed at the Old Bailey for Barrett, Mealing and Hart.
We've been able to build an unassailable case against them, meaning that they had really no option but to plead guilty.
Barrett pleaded guilty to conspiracy to import Class A drugs and possession with intent to supply, and was sentenced to 16 years. Mealing was sentenced to 12 years and 5 months after pleading guilty to conspiracy to import Class A drugs and money laundering. Hart pleaded guilty to conspiracy to import Class A drugs into the UK and was sentenced to 10 years and 9 months. Ryan was found guilty of perverting the course of justice and sentenced to 8 months.
The outcome and the sentencing involved was extremely satisfying for myself and the team. The amount of drugs involved was a substantial amount. The amount of money that was involved was substantial. And that would only have started the whole chain of events further down if those drugs had got into the market.
It's incredibly rewarding to know that all the diligence and expertise the officers have applied pays off.
The only person that was outstanding then, of course, was Rudy Sells, the pilot who had flown back to Belgium. But we certainly planned to make sure that he was also brought to justice as well, in collaboration with our Belgian colleagues.
The interesting thing was that he would have undoubtedly known that the arrests had been made back here in the UK, and possibly thought that as he hadn't landed, maybe he hadn't been seen, that there was no one had come knocking at his door the next day, that he was free as a bird.
The NCA were aware that Rudy's cells had continued on the day of the drop, onto northern France.
The French authorities were able to photograph cells arriving back at Le Touquet in the aircraft that we'd identified as flying over the Faversham area earlier that day. But in order to get him back here to the UK, we would need a European arrest warrant to be issued.
It would take more than a year until cells could be brought back to the UK to face the charges as a result of a European arrest warrant.
When he appeared in front of the judge, he was still wearing the red jumper that was significant on the days building up to the run that we'd seen more than a year before. The red jumper was certainly a significant way to recognise Rudy Sells, the Belgian pilot.
He also pled guilty to the offence of conspiracy to import Class A drugs into the UK.
Sells was sentenced to 14 years.
The conviction of Sells, I think, was important. The drop that he made over Kent that day took a lot of skill. Some people said at the time it was impossible to do. That sort of skill will be in high demand, and I'm sure if he hadn't been arrested and dealt with for this importation, he would certainly have gone on to do others.
Sentencing of over 50 years for all of those involved in this drug trafficking operation is really significant and really important. The harm that can be caused by trafficking this amount of cocaine into the UK is significant, and it's right that those crimes be met with that kind of sentence.
We'd stopped nearly 50 kilos of cocaine reaching the streets of the UK, which would inevitably bring further misery to the communities in which they would end up in. So, all in all, it was a very satisfying job from beginning to end.
This effective collaboration by the NCA and Border Force successfully brought this gang to justice. In dealing with the ever-changing challenges of protecting our borders, both organizations are more reliant than ever on members of the public to report suspicious activity. Small hidden and rural airstrips, local coastal fishing ports are all targets and are hard to monitor 24/7. If you see suspicious behavior, report it to Crime Stoppers or to your local police. It may be that vital piece of intelligence that the authorities are searching for.
Coming up, a brutal attack that leaves an innocent man fighting for his life.
How anyone could do that to another human being is beyond understanding.
Loss of a loved one is always devastating, but for a parent to lose a child is unbearable. This case involves an unexpected, brutal attack that devastated the lives of a loving family.
Connor Marshall was born in Barry, South Wales in 1996, her first child for Nadine and Richard.
First image I always get is just of this little blonde-haired boy with a lovely cheeky grin, chubby cheeks.
He really was. He was my little blue-eyed boy. He was defiant, very defiant, even from a very young age.
He was the first grandchild, the first nephew, first of everything, so it was quite, it was a big deal.
It's real magic. Any parent or grandparent will say that about their first, wonderful feeling. Just a lovely kid and a lovely adult.
When Connor turned 16, he was adamant he was going to get his bike licence, moped, because I had to bike myself. I used to take him out on the back of it all the time. 16th birthday, got him a scooter then, and he loved it. I don't know what it was like to have his own bit of freedom then.
He always wanted to just be happy and to see the world.
After Connor, Nadine and Richard had two other children, Georgia and a brother to Connor, Jack.
When I seen his mates, then it'd always be, you know, that's my older brother. He's the cool one, like, and growing up, he only got cooler. He got the piercings, he had the beard first, he had tattoos. It was always that one person I could turn to.
Connor planned to go away with friends for a weekend break at a caravan site down on the south coast of Wales, in Porthcawl.
I just remember how excited he was that, you know, he was 18 and he was maturing. He was finding his feet and he was enjoying, you know, making decisions. And this for him was quite a big deal. You know, I remember him saying it was sort of like a mini break. He was going, what, half an hour down the road. But he was really looking forward to it.
He was going with one of his best mates and his sister, and she had a baby. So I thought, well, that's good in a way, because there can't be any, can't get too, you know, rowdy and everything if there's a baby in the caravan.
And I got various pictures and sort of text messages. And then the text I had was, we're off into town. Unbeknownst to me, that was the last text. That's when it all went wrong.
At 7:22 a.m. on Sunday the 8th of March 2015, there was a knock on the door of the family's home.
I opened the curtain and I looked out the window and I looked down. I seen a police car there. Because we can't see the front door because it's round the corner. You know, I said, don't open the door, you know, but it was too late. She'd already opened the door.
And it was like being in a movie, really. It was sort of your whole room sort of closed in around.
There was two officers stood there and they just asked, will be Connor's parents? And there had been an incident.
Nadine and Richard rushed to the University Hospital of Wales in Cardiff.
We walked into the A&E and a man stood there and asked us who we were. He was a detective. And we were just firing questions at him, at each other. What is it? We didn't know what had happened, what this incident was.
He'd been attacked. They don't know who by. They were just trying to ask us questions. What's Connor like? What's he doing? And Connor was a quietish lad. He wasn't a fighter. He was 9 stone wet, you know?
And I remember it. I remember the words when the nurse said that Connor was in resus. That was like a real kick to the stomach, because it was sort of serious. It was that, what do you mean he's in resus?
Then I seen a trolley come along the corridor with somebody on there, and I looked, and I looked and I just seen a mess, and I just thought, oh God, that's terrible. And then I realised it was Connor.
Obviously, it was Connor, but it was so bruised and horrific and bloody, and lots of machinery and nurses sort of working around us, and there was nothing. You couldn't hold his hand, you couldn't do anything, and it was just horrible.
All I can remember seeing was Connor's bag on the floor, and there was police there, and they were going through the bag, and everything was just covered in blood. Everything just, world stopped then. It was just looked at Connor in his bed, and he was just unrecognisable.
The family want us to include these images of Connor's injuries in the programme, to highlight the severe extent of the damage inflicted upon him.
He was obviously hypothermic. There was severe internal injuries. There was his spleen had been ruptured. His eye socket had been completely shattered. There was all footprints over his body, over his face. It was just this long list of what you could see, and an even longer list of what you couldn't see was going on.
How anyone could do that to another human being was beyond understanding.
And they basically said that if there was no improvement, that there was very little they could continue to do.
Nadine and Richard were at Connor's bedside for the next 24 hours. South Wales police were leading the investigation into what had happened, and officers were providing snippets of information about the attack.
By about day 2, we were being told, we think we know who this man is. It's just, we know it's a male. and that he had gone to ground on the run, basically.
A manhunt was underway to find David Braddon. 26 years old and from South Wales, he was an early suspect for the police. They thought he'd gone back to his home in Caerphilly and was now in hiding up in Scotland. At the university hospital, 4 days after the attack, Connor's condition was not improving. Nadine and Richard were faced with the unthinkable.
The organ donation nurse came in and introduced herself, and I think I just lost the plot then, because there was no way was I going to entertain listening to her because of what it meant.
Then Nadine remembered a conversation she'd had with her son.
When he applied for the provisional licence at 16, at the time there was a box at the bottom that you had to complete to consent to organ donation. And he asked me, Mum, Mum, are you one of these? And I said, yeah, I'm one of them. And I remember explaining it to him and saying, look, it's what you want to do. And in his humour and naivety, he just looked at me and just went, Mum, who wouldn't want a piece of this?
Together, the family decided that it was right that after he passed, Connor's organs would be donated.
It was Connor's decision. He wanted it.
I just lied on his chest and kind of sent him away, kind of thing.
We all gave Connor a last kiss. And then we went.
At the very ending. Yeah, it was horrible.
He gave his liver and both kidneys and tissue samples, as well as bone marrow. And we know that the 3 recipients, they're all thriving.
South Wales police had located Braddon at a relative's in Scotland. Despite giving a false name when approached, he was arrested on suspicion of Connor's murder.
David's background is one of dysfunction. He's a guy who's grown up in quite a rough condition, and his behaviour has mirrored that. In fact, he's been charged with assault of actually a police officer. So it also stands that he has an issue with authority, full stop.
Using CCTV and witness statements, police had built a timeline of Braddon's movements on the day of the attack. Braddon had been staying at the same caravan site as Connor with his girlfriend and their young child.
Her ex-boyfriend is also, completely by chance, at the same caravan park. Instead of being able to just kind of leave that information, he starts to obsess about it, and he starts to get very, very angry. And from that point, we know that all he wants to do is essentially have it out with him, which in this case means being violent towards him.
Connor was in the same bar with his friends. He'd witnessed the argument but hadn't got involved. He then continued his night, went off-site to enjoy the evening in Porthcawl.
Connor had gone back to the caravan, and the baby was crying. And Connor didn't like babies crying. And he just said, I'm going out for a walk.
At approximately 1 a.m., Connor's world was about to collide with David Braddon's. Coming up, David Braddon carries out a shocking and brutal attack that leaves Connor fighting for his life. And so many unanswered questions.
"18-year-old Connor Marshall had left home to go on a weekend away with friends to a local caravan site. Little did he know that on the same site was David Braddon, a man with a violent disposition. Their paths were about to cross, with tragic consequences.
Braddon had been in his caravan drinking and taking drugs, including Valium. He'd used his girlfriend's phone to text her ex-boyfriend, trying to goad him to come out of his caravan to meet him.
David really ruminates about what's going to happen when he goes out to meet this ex-boyfriend. In fact, he arms himself with weapons, and we know that he's heavily under the influence of drugs and alcohol. So his mental state is already very unsteady. Add to that violent disposition, add to that premeditation with weapons, and you literally are only going to get one result.
David was a ticking time bomb. Connor did not know David. He was not the intended target, but was about to innocently become his victim.
It's a sustained attack. He uses weapons, he uses rocks, he uses pole around him. When you are attacked completely unprovoked, without any warning, you are highly unprepared. So David had the upper hand from the moment that he started that attack. Connor didn't know it was going to happen and couldn't have fought back. But that's not enough. He's got so carried away and so believes that this person deserves his vengeance that he then humiliates him.
Braddon stripped Connor after the attack, leaving him naked.
And that's about demonstrating ultimate power. I'm the person who's alpha. I'm the male. I'm the victor. And that's just how needy of that kind of victory David was.
Braddon fled the scene, leaving Connor fighting for his life alone in the middle of the night. He was discovered at 7 a.m. on Sunday morning.
He'd been lying there all night, stripped of his clothing, so the hypothermia had set in anyway, apart from these horrendous injuries.
I remember saying to the police, why Connor? And they then explained the scenario. He believed that it was the ex-boyfriend of his then partner. But we know from the medical evidence, Connor had no defence marks, so he had no time to defend himself. There was no evidence whatsoever to show that there was a struggle or anything.
Just 8 days after the attack, police charged Braddon with Connor's murder. He was expected to plead guilty at a plea hearing on the 26th of May 2015 at Cardiff Crown Court.
As far as we were concerned, it was a court that he'd admitted to this crime and that he would be there. But that wasn't the case.
He's the criminal. He's done this. He's murdered somebody. Yet he can say, no, I'm not going to turn up at court that day. So they done a video link.
And all you saw was this slob of a figure just slouched in a chair, and they asked him what he pleaded, and he said it. By admitting guilt, that meant that we wouldn't have a trial. I felt cheated because I wanted to know an awful lot more, and we wouldn't have that opportunity. And we've just seen the person that has just completely ruined and demolished and decimated our lives sat there as if he was just completely bored.
On the 3rd of June 2015, Braddon did appear in the dock to be sentenced.
I can remember just looking at him. Didn't look at us when he came up the stairs.
Braddon's lawyer said that he thought he was confronting and beating his ex-girlfriend's partner, and that after stripping and punching Connor again, he'd checked his face and realised he was the wrong person. The judge slammed Braddon for his sustained and brutal assault of Connor, and said that the aggravating features in this case were the significant degree of planning and the horrific physical suffering.
He talked quite a lot about the remorse that David Braddon had shown. And we just, I remember just thinking, hang on a minute, is he in the same room as what we're hearing? And the remorse and the regret. And for that reason, 5 years would be taken off his sentence as a reward for being remorseful. So that reduced his sentence from 25 years to 20 years, which meant and no parole for 19 years. And that was that. And as David Braddon had to turn, and at that point, it just crushed us because he just looked up at us. We were all up in the gallery and he just gave us a thumbs up.
You just think, it's just disgusting, absolutely disgusting.
Connor's family left court without the answers they had been looking for. Some months later, Nadine was surprised to receive a letter from the National Probation Service.
It was one sentence at the bottom of the letter. You may or may not be aware that the offender was under supervision at the time of the offence. Well, that was just like a lightning bolt.
Nadine learnt that Braddon was known to the authorities. He was being supervised by a private company on behalf of the probation service at the time of Connor's murder. She learnt that a review, called a Serious Further Offence Report, had been produced to look at the firm's handling of Braddon.
So we obviously wanted it. We wanted to know exactly what happened. Why was this animal allowed to be where he was if there were conditions? We were told several times that it was an internal document that was used for internal work in practice only. They were never shared with families. They never will be shared. It's not relevant to a family. And that was the way it was going to be. So the more they resisted, the more I pushed. You know, how can I know that there's this opportunity to have information to try and understand what happened and be told that as his mum, I can't have that? It just seemed illogical and unacceptable.
Despite several months of asking for the report, Nadine's requests were refused. After many meetings with executives and ministers, Nadine got hold of the report. Braddon had been given a community order of 12 months in June 2014 for assaulting a police officer and offences of possessing cocaine. Part of the terms of his order was to attend meetings with an offender manager.
It was there in black and white, and it said that 8 appointments had been missed between David Braddon and a probation officer. 3 follow-up letters had been sent, but never acted upon. Those 3 letters would have instigated breach proceedings, which would have meant that David Braddon wasn't allowed to be in Porthcawl at that time.
The SFO review found that no one could have foreseen that David Braddon would go on to commit such an offence, and that it was not predictable or preventable.
There's got to be transparency. There's got to be... I don't know why they hide it from us. What they're gaining, hiding, you know, or not telling us things. And, you know, how is people going to learn if it's all hidden away? It's just going... The system is just going to get worse and it'll just implode.
The Marshals launched a petition and funding page to ensure that other families in the same situation don't have that same struggle.
A Voice for Connor was created as our way of making sure that families do get a voice, because at the moment the probation system is set up in a way that it's all offender-led. I want probation to change legislation, to change policies, and to remember and to recognise that victims have to have an equal voice within the probation, within the rehabilitation process, because they're not heard.
Nadine has been contacted by numerous families that's gone through the same situation, asking her questions. So we feel like it's working that way.
The family's campaigning has also had an even wider impact. The Ministry of Justice have reviewed their guidance on accessibility to serious further offence reviews by victims and victims' families.
Cases like Connor's highlight the vulnerability of our lives. Connor did absolutely nothing wrong. He couldn't have prevented it. He couldn't have protected himself. And essentially, just by being on holiday that day, it caused the end of his life.
Connor will never be forgotten.
I want Connor to be remembered forever, obviously. I want him to be remembered for the kind, good-humoured person that he was. He was, you know, he was just my boy.
But every day I think of him. Some part of the day. You see faces, hear things, yeah, it reminds me of CJ, you know.
Don't take anything for granted and live every second to the full. Because you never know when it's going to be your last.
He's still my oldest son. He's my number one. He always will be.
The Ministry of Justice has told us that as of the 1st of April 2018, when an offender under supervision is charged and convicted with a serious further offence, victims or victims' families will now be entitled to receive the full serious further offence report. Cases predating that will be considered on a case-by-case basis, with a presumption that reviews will be shared. The new instruction to the National Probation Service and community rehabilitation centres is to provide victims with information about SFO reviews.